She describes that her father was a congressman. So usually when there's some sort of war, congressmen are usually the first people that the opposite side goes for. So there was nothing she could do but run away. While other people stayed put, she had to leave because of her father's safety. She also remembers the fact that the South Korean army, was going to all the houses and taking all the weapons. And at the time, since her father was a congressman, he owned a pistol. And she describes that after they took that pistol away, she felt a lot of feelings of vulnerability. My grandmother's family eventually made it to a place called Samchonpo, where they met up with one of her father's friends, who was able to provide them with a room at his house. But their family that was traveling was way too big to travel together, so eventually they had to split up. And the women split up from the rest of the group and went to a place called Yongro. As for my grandmother, she stayed with her brother and her father and headed on a boat to Masan. She remembers that on their way there were lots of stories of people drafting people for the South Korean army, and how sometimes they would have to hide in dark rooms with bags over their heads, so that they wouldn't be found and drafted. Eventually, my grandmother made it to Busan, which was, as you know, at the end, the only place that North Korea hadn't captured in the first invasion. She knew a lot of people in high places, such as the head of the women's police, a railroad company CEO, and that helped her with finding connections to get to Busan and find a house to stay. Eventually, they settled in Busan, with a house that a family friend had established for them, and they eventually established a settled life. My grandma says the hardest part about living a settled life in Busan was that there were so many sounds around, so many noises, um, of people getting drafted to the army, people, resisting the drafting to the army. And she remembers that if she had been discovered, that her brother and her father would have been drafted into the army. One unique thing also about my grandmother is that she was pregnant at the time of the evacuation with my oldest uncle. So therefore, it was really tiring for her to keep evacuating while the baby was inside her stomach. So she recounts an experience in when she found a kind of a wooden plank that a man had used for advertising, and my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, laid that down for her, and then brought a candle because it was dark, and she kind of laid there to rest. Kind of shows kind of the trials and tribulations of being pregnant while on such a dangerous journey. As the American soldiers eventually pushed the North Korean soldiers up, my grandma's family was eventually able to end their evacuation and move back up to where they were from. Since my grandma's husband was a college professor, he went to Gwangju early, while the rest of the family followed about 2 months after. Life didn't get any better though at the time. Right after the war, there was a home, and there was a school where my grandfather worked, but in order to make money, their family had to raise a pig and a chicken, and my grandmother remembers that while they were trying to get pig food for the pig, people would always criticize them, saying that people around them didn't have enough to eat, and what they were trying to do was trying to get food for an animal, which was the pig. Eventually, they didn't have enough money to support the pig, and so they eventually had to eat that as well. However, my grandmother always wants to emphasize that she was relatively well off compared to many others. If you think that she was suffering, people around her, especially people in the countryside, were suffering much, much worse lives. She explains that some people had to boil grass and tree bark in order to stay alive. Those were the things that they ate every day. Um, but even so, her experience, she says that if history were to repeat itself and the Korean War were to happen again, that she'd rather just collapse and die. She would not want to go through it again. All in all, my grandmother went from living in Gwangju, living a peaceful life before the war, as she described, one that, although it wasn't the best, it was good for the time that she was living in. She worked as a doctor, and her husband worked as a college professor, which were both very respected jobs back then. And she had many connections, people in high places. Her father was a congressman. But then after the war broke out, eventually she had to run away all the way down to Busan. And luckily, by miracles, she found places to stay. She found connections in which she could ride trains to the places that she could go to. She took a train down to Busan because she knew someone in the railroad company who was actually the CEO of the railroad company. So she ended up in Busan and settled there until the war was over. And then she went back up to Gwangju. She describes the rebuilding process as something that was also very, very horrible. It was hard for families to eat. Some would even live off grass and tree bark, things that we couldn't even imagine doing. In terms of the political aspects, she prefers not to talk about them, mostly because it's kind of unsafe and kind of too tense between North and South Korea right now to be revealing those kinds of things. If it gets into the wrong hands, it could potentially put her or her family in danger. So I think that kind of shows the situation that North Korea and South Korea are in right now, in terms of tension, and how one political, you know, saying from one person can lead to, something bad to happen. She also had a very hard time as she was running away. I think what's really unique about it is that she was actually pregnant with my uncle while she was running away. So she had to deal with the pains of childbirth, the pains of labor, the pains of pregnancy basically while running away from the North Korean soldiers. So all in all, even though she hasn't suffered as much as nearly a lot of people that were in the countryside, she said she would never live to see the Korean War again. She does not want that to happen ever again.